The importance of government balancing its budget. That's the subject of this week's Point of Order podcast. Hi, I'm Joseph Benamy. Thanks for listening. As of the date of this recording, January 15th, 2014, Canada's federal government is preparing a budget for its upcoming fiscal year that some are speculating could be balanced for the first time since 2008. And even if the budget isn't balanced, barring some unforeseen economic disaster in the next few weeks, its deficit should continue its downward trend, setting up a balanced budget for 2015. In contrast to this, the Government of Ontario, where I live, reported in its fall financial update that the province's deficit stood at almost $12 billion. This doesn't sound like much, but there remains no credible plan to eliminate the overspending, meaning that the public debt in Ontario will continue to grow beyond its current and crushing $272 billion for the foreseeable future. That's a staggering $20,000 in personal debt owed by every man, woman, and child in Ontario, courtesy of successive governments, both from the left and the right of the political spectrum. As troubling as all this is, it pales in comparison to what's going on with our friends to the south who, likewise under successive governments of the so-called left and right, have managed to accumulate a national debt of more than $17 trillion. And despite the bickering and battling in Washington, there's no end in sight to the borrowing. The argument between deficit hawks like myself who believe that governments should never plan to spend more money than they collect in taxes, and those who consider it acceptable, even commendable that governments do, especially during times of high unemployment and slow economic growth, originates in a disagreement over whether or not a national economy should or even can be managed effectively through a government's fiscal policy. Fiscal policy refers to how government taxes, spends, and, if necessary, borrows money. It's reflected in government's budget. Some economists, mostly those who adhere to Keynesian economic theory, named after its chief proponent, British economist John Maynard Keynes, argue that government can and should stimulate economic growth through its fiscal policy by spending more during times of economic contraction. This dispute was more or less settled in the 1980s when governments of the Western industrialized countries abandoned Keynesian economics en masse in favor of monetary policy to combat the high unemployment and soaring inflation that was crippling their economies at the time. Monetary policy refers to how governments control the supply of money in the economy. It was a combination of sound monetary policy and fiscal restraint that finally succeeded in bringing these chronic problems under control. Given this impressive record, it's a little surprising that there are still those who believe in managing, or more to the point stimulating, economic activity through government spending, that's to say, through fiscal policy. Equally surprising is the political success these neo-Keynesians have enjoyed in recent years. This doesn't mean, however, that the practice is any more effective or that the theory behind the practice is any more sound. In the first place, while there's no doubt that government spending can spur economic growth, that growth is limited only to those sectors of the economy where the spending takes place. And because government has no money of its own to spend, every dollar it injects through spending into one sector of the economy must be extracted from another, more productive sector through taxation. If it's true that injecting money through government spending stimulates job creation in those sectors of the economy where it happens, then it must also be true that extracting money through taxation suppresses job creation in those sectors of the economy where that happens. The net gain for the economy overall, therefore, is zero. That might not be readily apparent since jobs may not be actually lost in those sectors where the taxation occurs. What you never see, however, and therefore can't measure, are the jobs and wealth never created in those sectors as a consequence of the policy. This isn't ideology, it's just basic math. Of course, this assumes that government spends no more than it collects in taxes, In other words, that its budget is balanced. What if, however, instead of spending only as much as it collects in taxes, government borrows the money, then spends it, thus sparing those productive sectors of the economy the extra tax burden? Here, then, is the supposed magic of Keynesian economics. You get to enjoy the benefit of increased government spending in struggling sectors of the economy without suffering the commensurate negative effect of imposing higher taxes on those sectors that are performing well. Like all magic, however, no matter how real the illusion appears to be, it's still just an illusion. Consider for a moment the accumulated $272 billion deficit I referred to earlier that successive Ontario governments have amassed. Let's assume that the provincial government balances its budget for the next 20 years, and that it plans over that period of time to pay off that debt. To do this, it would have to raise $27 billion more in taxes each year that it spends. Put another way, it would have to extract from the economy over time exactly the same amount of money that it injected into the economy when running a deficit. More when you factor interest into the equation, all with the same negative results. Deficit financing is not a way of avoiding higher taxes or their consequences. It's merely a way of deferring those higher taxes. Similarly, a tax cut at a budget with a deficit isn't really a tax cut no matter what the politicians say. It's merely a tax deferment because it's being paid for in the first place with borrowed money that must itself be paid back at a later date. Once again, the effect of this sort of fiscal policy may not be readily apparent because it manifests itself not in the loss of existing jobs, but in jobs and wealth never created. It gets worse. If the balanced budget in the scenario I've just outlined were to be set at, let's say, $100 billion a year, the value of actual goods and services taxpayers would receive in that scenario for every dollar they pay in taxes would be only 73 cents, since 27% of the budget would be allocated to paying the debt. This assumes, however, that no payments are made on the debt incurred until the budget is actually balanced. In the real world, that never happens. Payment of debt is an ongoing process that itself can't be put off. In practice, governments must include servicing of previously accumulated debt in their unbalanced budgets. In other words, they borrow not just to finance their ongoing operations, but to pay back previously borrowed money. This results in an accelerated or compounded erosion of the purchasing power of tax dollars, a phenomenon that I refer to as tax inflation. The actual numbers may change depending on the unique circumstances of the jurisdiction under consideration, but the principle remains the same in every case and at all times. The impact on economic performance overall isn't the only issue either. There's a personal component to this as well. Remember, the $272 billion debt that I referred to earlier translates into a personal debt of $20,000 for every man, woman, and child in the province. That's how much more in taxes each individual would have to pay over the 10-year period, or more accurately, since most people, particularly children, pay little or no taxes directly, that's the amount those who do pay taxes would have to pay on behalf of every man, woman, and child to retire the debt. For the average family of 4, that would be $40,000 over 10 years in overtaxation that could be spent on the mortgage or college tuition for the kids. Once again, this isn't ideology, it's just basic math. But there's another, even more important reason why governments should never engage in the sort of deficit financing we've been talking about, one that has nothing to do with economic theory whatsoever. Let's go back again to our example where the government plans to pay off its accumulated deficit of $272 billion over 10 years. If the deficits that resulted in this debt began 18 years ago, that would mean that taxpayers who turn 18 when the decision is made to pay the debt will be paying for goods and services, the purchase and consumption of which they never had a say in through the democratic process. And if government decides to extend the debt retirement period to 20 years instead of 10, people who were not even born when the debt was incurred will be forced to pay. We often hear politicians and concerned citizens talking about the injustice of making future generations pay our debts. But do we really appreciate the implication of this insidious practice? I've often made the observation that the institution of Parliament evolved over many centuries not as an instrument of governance, but rather as a check on executive power, particularly the power to raise revenue through taxation. The phrase, no taxation without representation, isn't just a nice cliché deployed by revolutionaries of the past to stir up unrest. It's the very cornerstone of our democratic system. Because it's little more than tax deferment, and because those deferred taxes are paid primarily by those who, due to age, have no say in the spending decisions for which the borrowing was done, deficit financing isn't just unjust. It's the ultimate violation of the principle of no taxation without representation, a crime against democracy itself. In 1939, after 7 long years as Treasury Secretary in the Roosevelt administration, Henry Morgenthau, a close friend and confidant of the president, concluded that, good intentions notwithstanding, the fiscal policies embodied in the New Deal had been a failure, observing that, quote, "We have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot," end quote. The best policy for governments to adopt at all times, but especially during recessionary times, is to keep their taxes low, keep their spending under control, and keep their budgets balanced. That's this week's Point of Order podcast, brought to you by the Arthur Meehan Institute for Public Affairs. Don't forget to check out our website, www.meehaninstitute.org, where you can obtain conservative thought and analysis on a wide range of current events and public policy issues. That's www.meigheninstitute.org. Or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. The address is pointoforder, all one word, at meehaninstitute.org. That's pointoforder at meehaninstitute.org. I'm Joseph Benamy. Thanks for listening.